Hundreds of thousands of Persians, war elephants, and deadly scythed chariots stood against an army several times smaller. It should have been Alexander's end. Instead, within hours, Darius III was fleeing the battlefield, and the Persian Empire crumbled. The night before destiny, silence clung heavily over the plains near Gaugamela. The Persian Empire, vast and ancient, had stretched its arm once more to resist the young conqueror from the west. King Darius III had summoned the strength of his empire, infantry from Babylon, cavalry from Bactria, mercenaries from Greece, chariots with blades fastened to their wheels, and even the mighty war elephants whose presence alone could crush the courage of men. Estimates whispered through the camps. The Persian host was said to be over 200,000 strong, perhaps more, a tidal wave of soldiers gathered to defend centuries of kingship. And yet, on the opposite side of the plain, Alexander of Macedon prepared his 35,000 men with the quiet confidence of a predator. He was only 25 years old, but his name had already shaken Asia. From the Granicus River to Issus, he had carved through the Persian defenses, toppling satrapies like dominoes. Now, before him, stretched the greatest challenge of his campaign, the battle that would decide not merely territory, but the fate of empires. The Macedonian camp was smaller, quieter. The men were veterans, hardened by years of campaigning. Around their fires, they polished shields and checked the edges of their sarissas, the long pikes of the phalanx. Cavalrymen whispered to their horses, their armor catching faint glints of firelight. In the command tent, Alexander leaned over maps lit by flickering oil lamps. At his side stood Parmenion, his seasoned general, urging caution. "We are outnumbered 10 to 1, he said gravely. "The ground favors their chariots. A frontal assault would be madness." Alexander's eyes gleamed with the fire of vision. "Madness to them," he replied. "But necessity to us. Darius fights with numbers. We fight with purpose. His army is a gathering of nations, mine is a single fist. Tomorrow, I will strike at the heart, and when the heart falters, the body dies." Outside, the stars burned over Mesopotamia. The men could feel the weight of the moment, though none knew if they would live to see another dawn. History itself seemed to hold its breath. Tomorrow, the world would change. Dawn broke with a crimson fire on the horizon, as if the heavens themselves bled in anticipation of the slaughter to come. The plain of Gaugamela stretched vast and open, flattened deliberately by Darius' engineers to give room for his scythed chariots to charge. It was a killing ground designed for terror, and the Persian king intended to use every advantage. Across the field, the Persian army assembled in an endless tide of men and beasts. War drums thundered, echoing like the heartbeat of the empire itself. Chariots gleamed in the rising light, their bronze blades sharpened to slice through flesh and bone. The elephants, towering and restless, swayed in their chains, trumpeting with a sound that made even the bravest shiver. Behind them, rows upon rows of infantry stretched farther than the eye could follow, Babylonians, Medes, Armenians, Scythians on horseback with deadly bows. At the center, beneath a canopy of royal purple, stood Darius himself, resplendent in gold, a living symbol of Persia's grandeur. On the opposite ridge, Alexander's Macedonians were already forming their lines. The phalanx bristled with thousands of sarissas pointing toward the rising sun, a wall of iron and discipline. On the right flank, Alexander positioned his companion cavalry, the elite horsemen who had followed him across seas and deserts. Their armor was plain compared to Persia's gold, but their eyes burned with loyalty. On the left, Parmenion took command, tasked with holding back the storm that would inevitably descend. Before the lines were set, Alexander mounted Bucephalus, his black warhorse, a creature as fierce and loyal as his master. The king rode along his troops, his voice carrying across the plain. "Soldiers of Macedon. Before us stands the multitude of Asia. They trust in numbers, in elephants, in chariots. But we," he raised his sword toward the sun, "we trust in each other. In discipline, in courage, in the gods who favor the bold. Today, we strike not at men, but at an empire. Follow me, and the world is ours." The men roared, the sound rolling like thunder. On the Persian side, horns blared, and the ground shook as the first chariots began to roll forward, their wheels gleaming like fangs. The battle for the ancient world had begun. The plain rumbled as the scythed chariots surged forward, their wheels slicing the earth, their blades flashing wickedly in the sun. Whips cracked, horses screamed, and dust rose in choking clouds. The Persians roared in triumph, for these machines had been designed to break the Macedonian phalanx, to scatter men like frightened sheep. From his vantage point, Darius watched, confident. He imagined the iron-tipped sarissas splintering under the chariot's charge, the disciplined lines dissolving in panic. The spectacle was meant not only to kill, but to terrify. But Alexander had foreseen this. Weeks before, he had drilled his men relentlessly for this very moment. As the chariots thundered closer, Macedonian trumpets blared sharp commands. With practiced precision, the phalanx parted into narrow lanes, opening gaps like trapdoors. Soldiers raised shields and shouted, guiding the horses inward. The result was chaos, for the Persians. The chariots hurtled into the lanes, where javelins and spears pierced the horses, dragging their riders down. Some Macedonians grabbed at the reins, yanking drivers from their seats, stabbing them before they could recover. Others hurled stones and arrows into the charging beasts, causing them to veer and crash into one another. What was meant to be a storm became a tangle of wreckage, screams, and blood. One chariot broke through, its blades cutting into a handful of men, severing legs and scattering shields. But even here, discipline prevailed. The nearest companion cavalry wheeled around, their lances thrusting deep into the horses, toppling the chariot before it could carve deeper into the ranks. Alexander watched it unfold with a calm intensity, Bucephalus snorting beneath him. He turned to his officers with a grim smile. "The Persians think us prey," he said. "Let them learn we are hunters." As the dust cleared, the once mighty chariot assault lay in ruins, twisted wheels and dying horses littering the ground. The Persians had lost their first gamble, and the Macedonian line still stood unbroken, gleaming like a wall of bronze. Yet Darius did not falter. He raised his hand, and a new command thundered across the field. Cavalry wings began to sweep forward, Bactrian horsemen on the left, Scythian archers on the right. The real storm was about to break. From the Persian lines came a sound like rolling thunder, hooves, tens of thousands of them. Cavalry surged outward in great wings, stretching farther than the Macedonian eye could see. On the Persian right, Scythian horse archers galloped with terrifying speed, loosing volleys of arrows that darkened the sky. On the left, Bactrian and Armenian heavy cavalry charged with lances poised, their scale armor flashing like fish in a sunlit sea. At the center, Darius watched with satisfaction. The trap was tightening. His plan was simple: stretch the Macedonian line until it snapped. Parmenian's left flank would be crushed beneath the weight of his cavalry, while the center would be drowned under the endless ranks of Persian infantry. Then Alexander, cut off, would be surrounded and destroyed. On the Macedonian left, Parmenion braced his men for impact. "Hold the line," he bellowed, his voice raw with age yet iron with command. The Persian cavalry struck like a tidal wave. Shields buckled, men staggered, and horses reared as bronze met steel. The clash was deafening, a storm of screams, metal, and blood. The Scythians darted in and out, their arrows striking gaps in armor, while Bactrian horsemen pressed relentlessly with spears. Parmenian's Thessalian cavalry, the finest riders of Greece, countercharged with fierce determination. They wheeled their horses into the Persian masses, lances finding throats, swords hacking through armor. The field became a swirling chaos of horseflesh and men locked in deadly knots. Despite their courage, the Macedonian left began to bend under pressure. Parmenion himself was nearly struck down by a spear, saved only by a bodyguard who threw himself into the blow. Dust and blood blinded the combatants, cries of the wounded mingled with the shouts of officers struggling to keep formation. Meanwhile, Alexander watched intently from the right. His companions itched to charge, but he held them back, eyes fixed not on the cavalry melee but on the distant figure of Darius at the center. He saw what few others did: the Persians were overcommitting their wings, leaving their heart exposed. A dangerous opportunity was forming. Still, Parmenian's desperate messages arrived one after another: "We are being overwhelmed. We need reinforcements now." The choice weighed heavy. Would Alexander ride to save his general, or risk everything in a strike at the Persian king himself? The fate of empires trembled on the edge of his decision. The battlefield was a storm without horizon. Dust rose in choking clouds, arrows whistled, men screamed, steel clashed against steel. On the left, Parmenion still fought desperately to hold his ground, his cavalry locked in a deadly struggle with the Persian tide. Yet Alexander's eyes were fixed on one place alone: the Persian king. Through the shifting chaos, Alexander saw Darius seated high on his royal chariot, surrounded by his guard of Persian nobles and immortals. The royal standard, a golden eagle on a tall pole, rose above him, a beacon to his entire army. If that standard fell, the heart of Persia would falter. Then came the moment he had waited for. In their zeal to crush Parmenion, the Persian cavalry had overextended, leaving a gap in the center of their line. It was not wide, but wide enough for a masterstroke. Alexander's pulse quickened. The gods had opened the door. He turned to his companions, their faces grim but eager, their horses restless with fire. "With me!" Alexander roared, raising his ziphos high. Into the heart of Asia. With a trumpet scream, the companions surged forward, a wedge of steel and fury cutting across the plain. At their point rode Alexander himself, Bucephalus thundering beneath him, his bronze helmet gleaming like a star in the dust. The charge struck with the force of a hammer. Persian cavalry reeled back in shock, unprepared for the sudden fury. Spears thrust, horses crashed, men fell crushed beneath hooves. The wedge drove deeper, straight toward Darius. Macedonians shouted Alexander's name as they hacked through the guard. Persian nobles fell screaming, their armor useless against the ferocity of the charge. In the chaos, Alexander's gaze locked with Darius for a heartbeat, a king challenging a king. But courage failed the great king. Panic swept him like a shadow. He wrenched his horses around, abandoning his chariot, and fled toward the east with a knot of guards. His golden canopy toppled, his royal standard swaying as the immortals struggled to shield their retreat. A ripple of disbelief surged through the Persian army. Their king, divine heir of Achaemenid glory, was fleeing. Confusion spread like wildfire. Some units fought on blindly, others began to falter, casting fearful glances toward the vanishing figure of Darius. Alexander had struck the blow he promised, the heart of Persia was bleeding. When Darius turned his back on the field, the echo of his retreat spread faster than any trumpet blast. Men who moments before had fought with pride now hesitated, their eyes darting to the east where their king disappeared in a swirl of dust. The great golden standard of Persia trembled in uncertain hands, its power waning with every hoofbeat of Darius' flight. At the center, the immortals, the king's legendary guard, 10,000 strong, faced the impossible. Loyal to the last, they closed ranks to shield the retreat, their spears glittering in tight formation. Macedonian cavalry crashed against them, Alexander himself at the forefront, cutting through their line like a blade. The immortals fought bravely, their discipline unshaken, but without their king their resistance felt hollow, desperate rather than inspired. One by one, their banners fell. Elsewhere, confusion reigned. Units of Persian infantry, seeing their monarch's canopy gone, began to waver. Some threw down their weapons and fled, others scattered in panic, trampling their own comrades in the rush to escape. The elephants, once a terror, now panicked at the smell of blood and the clamor of collapsing lines. Trumpeting wildly, they broke free from their handlers, crushing Persians and Macedonians alike in their blind stampede. On the Macedonian left, Parmenion still fought for his life. He had not seen Darius flee, and his men were locked in brutal combat with the Persian cavalry. Sweat and blood soaked his armor as he urged his Thessalians to hold. Just when his flank seemed ready to collapse, messengers arrived with word, "The king has broken the Persian center. Darius has fled." The effect was electric. Courage surged through weary Macedonian riders. With renewed fury, they countercharged, driving the Persian horsemen back step by step. What had been a desperate defense turned into a relentless push. Across the plain, the tide was shifting. The vast army of Persia, larger, richer, more splendid, was unraveling like a tapestry cut at its center. What had taken centuries to build was crumbling in hours. From horseback, Alexander raised his sword, bloodied and gleaming. His voice rang above the chaos, "Press them. Let no man doubt who holds the world this day." The Macedonians roared, surging forward with unstoppable momentum. The empire of Darius was disintegrating before their eyes. Dust clouds rose in the east, where Darius fled with the remnants of his guard. His chariot abandoned, the great king now clung to the saddle of a swift horse, driven by fear rather than command. Behind him, a stream of Persian nobles and cavalry galloped desperately, their formation broken, their honor forgotten. Alexander saw it, victory was within his grasp. If he pursued now, if he struck down Darius on the field, the Persian Empire would die with its king. No satrap, no general, no noble could rally Asia without him. The gods themselves seemed to whisper in Alexander's ear, "Seize him, and the world is yours." He urged Bucephalus forward, companions thundering behind him, carving through scattered Persians in pursuit. The chase had begun. The dust stung his eyes, the wind roared in his ears, his heart pounded with the rhythm of destiny. But then, messengers galloped from the left, their cries cutting through the chaos. "Parmenion is surrounded. The left is collapsing. He begs for aid." Alexander reined in Bucephalus, his jaw clenched. The decision tore at him. Before him, the promise of an empire, the chance to end the war with a single stroke. Behind him, his oldest general, the man who had fought beside his father, was fighting for his life, and with him, thousands of Macedonian soldiers. He looked once more toward the fleeing Darius, now a speck in the distance, vanishing with every heartbeat. Then he turned westward, toward the smoke and cries of his embattled left. For a moment, he closed his eyes, as though weighing fate itself. At last, he wrenched Bucephalus around. "We will not buy empire with betrayal," Alexander said through gritted teeth. "Our comrades stand before all." The companions followed as he rode hard toward Parmenion. They plunged back into the storm of cavalry, their lances striking with renewed ferocity. Macedonian and Thessalian horsemen, reinvigorated by their king's arrival, roared in triumph as the tide shifted once more. Darius vanished into the horizon, his life spared by Alexander's loyalty. Yet his flight had already poisoned Persia's heart. The plain of Gaugamela was no longer a battlefield but a graveyard in the making. The once mighty Persian host, a sea of banners and spears at dawn, was now a broken flood spilling in every direction. Without the steadying hand of their king, discipline collapsed. Units that had marched proudly into the fight now dissolved into frightened mobs, casting aside weapons in a frantic rush to escape. The elephants, maddened and uncontrollable, crashed through their own lines, trampling soldiers who moments earlier had cheered their presence. The scythed chariots, once symbols of terror, lay shattered and burning amid heaps of corpses. The great wings of cavalry that had threatened to engulf the Macedonians now fled piecemeal, harried by relentless Thessalian riders who pressed them without mercy. At the center, the immortals, those who had once been the pride of Persia, fought to the last, encircled by Alexander's companions and the advancing phalanx. Their golden robes and ornate armor gleamed even as they fell, their final stand a noble but futile gesture. When their standard finally toppled, crushed beneath the hooves of Bucephalus, a great cry went up. Persia's heart had ceased to beat. Alexander himself was everywhere, his sword red, his armor dented, his voice carrying above the din. He urged his men forward, driving the rout deeper. Macedonians cheered his name as they cut down fleeing foes, their exhaustion washed away by the euphoria of victory. Parmenion, bloodied but unbowed, finally secured the left flank. His riders pushed the last of the Bactrian cavalry into a desperate retreat, the survivors scattering toward the hills. When he raised his hand in signal, the battlefield stretched before him like a vast ruin, the Persians undone, their empire broken in a single day. And yet, Alexander's face was not one of triumph but of fire. He looked east, where Darius had escaped, and his eyes burned with the hunger of unfinished conquest. Victory had been won, but destiny still demanded its price. The sun sank lower, casting long shadows over the corpses that carpeted the plain. The Battle of Gaugamela was over. The world would never be the same. When the dust of Gaugamela finally settled, the plain was littered with the wreckage of two worlds. The Persians had left behind a harvest of bodies so vast that the earth itself seemed drowned in blood. Estimates whispered among the Macedonians spoke of tens of thousands slain, though no man could count them all. Macedonian losses were far fewer, yet every empty space in the phalanx, every riderless horse, was a wound Alexander felt deeply. As the wounded cried out across the field, scavengers, human and animal alike, descended. The sun beat down mercilessly, turning armor into furnaces and the stench of death into a choking haze. Officers moved among the survivors, rallying the men, gathering prisoners, and collecting the spoils of Persia's might. Chariots and elephants, once thought invincible, now lay twisted and abandoned, mute reminders of a fallen strategy. In the Persian camp, treasures lay untouched. Darius had fled so quickly that he left behind his chariot, his bow, and even his royal cloak, a symbol of kingship now seized by Alexander. When the Macedonians entered the luxurious tents, they found riches beyond imagining, silks, gold, jeweled ornaments. Yet Alexander forbade plunder until the wounded had been cared for, proving again why his men loved him as both commander and king. For the Persians, despair spread like wildfire. Messengers galloped from city to city with the grim tidings: Darius had fled, his army shattered. Babylon, Susa, and Persepolis trembled at the news. The great empire, once thought eternal, now stood naked before the storm. Alexander gathered his generals that night. The campfires flickered as he spoke: "This day we have broken an empire. But Darius lives, and so long as he lives, Persia will cling to hope. We march east, not to chase a man, but to claim a world." His words carried into the silence, into the hearts of men who had seen the impossible and survived. Exhaustion battled with awe. They had not merely fought a battle, they had torn down the walls of history itself. Far away, in the darkness of the Persian highlands, Darius rode on, haunted by shame and fear, yet still alive. The game was not yet ended. The night after Gaugamela was heavy with silence, broken only by the crackle of campfires and the distant cries of the wounded. The stars above Mesopotamia glittered cold and eternal, as if watching the turning of ages. Alexander walked alone among the men, his armor still scarred with the day's battle, his cloak stained with dust and blood. Soldiers rose as he passed, some too weary to cheer, others whispering his name as though speaking of a figure already half divine. To them, he was no longer merely a king, he was the breaker of empires, the chosen of destiny. When he reached a low ridge overlooking the battlefield, he halted. The plain below stretched like a terrible tapestry, abandoned shields, broken chariots, corpses scattered beneath the moonlight. What had begun that morning as Persia's proud stand was now a ruin, an empire undone in a single stroke. Parmenion approached, limping but alive. "It is finished," he said, his voice hoarse with exhaustion. Alexander shook his head slowly. "No, old friend. It has only begun. Darius still breathes, and until his shadow is gone, the world will not yield to us. He raised his gaze eastward, toward the dark horizon where Persia's heartlands lay. Beyond Babylon, beyond Persepolis, beyond the mountains and deserts, the path stretched endless. Yet Alexander's eyes burned with the hunger of a man who could not stop, who would not stop. The next morning, as dawn lit the sky with fire, the Macedonian army gathered. Trumpets blared, banners rose, and the men shouted as one, Alexander, Basileus of Asia. The title, once claimed by kings of Persia, now belonged to the son of Philip from distant Macedon. And so, with Bucephalus stamping impatiently beneath him, Alexander mounted once more. He raised his sword, its blade catching the first light of day, and spoke to his army. From this day, the world lies open. We will march until there are no more lands to conquer, until no man doubts that Macedon holds the earth. The men roared, their voices shaking the plain, drowning the silence of death with the promise of eternity. Thus ended the Battle of Gaugamela, not merely a victory, but the birth of a new age. Persia had fallen, and in its place rose the empire of Alexander, boundless as the horizon.